Johnny Keith Hill. I was born March the 3rd, 1927, in Parkdale, Arkansas. My mother's name was Jimmy Burdine. My father's name was Huey Salmon. I had two brothers and two sisters. My older sister was named Mary Louise. My second sister was named Alice Burdine. My oldest brother was named Huey Higdon, and the next brother was named James Bennett. My grandmother and grandfather on my mother's side were named Higdon, and my grandmother name on my father's side was named Eliza. Her parents' name were Bennetts. My grandmother's maiden name on my mother's side was named O'Neill. So my antecedents' names were Higdon, O'Neill, Hill, and Bennett. And this is a combination of Scotch and Irish. My earliest recollection of Parkdale was a big house with high ceilings and a porch with a swing on it. One of the earliest recollections of anything that happened to me was that in front of the house there was a slight ditch, a slope, and in that slope was a water main, a water meter main, and I fell and hit my head on that main, and that, as I remember, gave me a great deal of pain. I was the youngest of the 5 children, and so consequently there are many things that happened to them that I don't remember. I remember very little about home life with my 2 older sisters, Louise and Burdine. I remember more of home life with my 2 brothers, Higdon and James. I remember in particular one time my brother Higdon slipped and fell on a concrete step in front of the store that was owned by my father and broke his leg, and he was taken to a hospital and a cast was put up on it. I remember also at that same day Elton, who was my mother's brother's child, Elton Eldridge Higdon. I remember that day he came to live with us and lived with us off and on most of his life. He was living with us at that time, and I remember we were playing on some cotton. The cotton had been baled and was stored next to our home. And he and I were playing on it, and we turned the bale over, and it fell on a cat. I tried to get the cat out, and the cat bit me. And we lived next door to a Dr. Holliday, and so the black lady, nurse, cook, companion of mine, who was there keeping us, took me next door, and he doctored my hand. I remember of the 3 injuries that day: my brother Higdon's broken leg, my bitten hand by a cat, and the cat's broken back. It was broken when the bale of cotton fell over on him. The first to recover was the cat. It seemed that we always had cats around the house. They were favorites of my mother. And we always had dogs. And of course, since my people were farmers, my father was a farmer and a merchant, we always had horses and cows and mules. And of course, the cows to give the milk that we used at home, and the horses and mules to farm the land. I remember faintly some of the farming operations that went on before World War II and before the advent, at least the ownership of tractors by my family. All of the land was farmed by mules. And we had a great number of mules, and there were a great number of tenants on the farm. By tenants, there were people that would live in houses on the farm that we owned, and they would farm the land, and in the farming of the land, they farmed it for a share of the crops. My father furnished the mules and the feed stuff and the seed and the land and the people and the fertilizer, and the people furnished the labor, and for that they received a portion of the crops, and my father received a portion of the crops. In addition to that, my father had what was known as a cash crop. In other words, he hired people to farm it. Now, he used the people on the farm primarily so they could earn some cash money during the times that the farming operation was going on and before the harvest occurred. In addition to that, he provided them so much money in goods per month for them to be able to live until the time that the crops were harvested and the money was secured. And once a year, they had a settling up process that went about. I lived in a very small community, a farming community, where everybody in the community was primarily occupied with farming. It was a different day and time. The people in the community, their leisure time, which was very small because it was very difficult even earn a living. But the leisure time was done. Church, of course, was the big gathering point, plus the school, and in the school there were athletic events that were well attended, and also there were dances and there were plays and different sorts of things. Most of the entertainment provided in the community were provided inside the community, with the exception of radio. At my boyhood times, radio was a big thing, and there were certain times of the day that certain radio programs would come on that everybody would wait for. Another of the great, one of the things that we had to enjoy was automobile trips on Sunday afternoon. It was a great treat and a great treasure and a great pleasure to go off to some far-off place, maybe 25 or 30 miles away, simply in an automobile, and to look at the country and to do whatever we did when we got there. As a young boy, my principal companion and my principal friend was my cousin Elton. Even though he and I had different kinds of personality and enjoyed different things, we were fiercely supportive of each other, and that lasted throughout our lifetimes. I depended on him, and he depended on me. I never will forget an instance. One of our relatives, who was an alcoholic, one of my rich relatives, by the way, who at that time was fairly rich, the O'Neill family, I might just disperse and just go back for a minute as this comes into my mind. The O'Neill family came to Parkdale, Arkansas from Mississippi. All of my mother's people came from Mississippi. And when the O'Neill people came to Mississippi, one of the things that I remember being told about them is that they swam their cattle across the Mississippi River. At that time, about the only way to get across the Mississippi was by ferry boats. And this was prior to 1900. The O'Neills and the Higdons were fairly well-to-do families in Mississippi, particularly prior to the Civil War. That Civil War, as it did to most people, devastated part of the wealth that they had created. But anyway, back to this story about Elton and I. One Sunday afternoon, I don't know why Elton and I were there by ourselves. We were, I don't know, 12 or 13 years old, I'm not sure. Anyway, we were at home by ourselves. One of our rich relatives named Sanders O'Neill, came to the house, and he was an alcoholic, and he was, at the time, he was fairly well inebriated. And he really scared us to death. And I remember Elton standing behind the door with a stick of stowwood in his hand, and he said, if he comes around that door, I'm going to hit him. But pretty soon our folks came down, and they calmed him down and got him away and got him to where he needed to be. He was a very pleasant individual when he was sober, and he was one of those persons that could make things turn to money, but he finally wound up broke, lost all of his land, and alcohol absolutely destroyed him. One of the things that always impressed me about the little community of Parkdale is that everybody knew everybody's business. Everybody had knowledge of what was going on, and the community was too small, and everybody just knew everything that was happening, so there was really not any secrets in the community. I might just talk a little bit about my relationships with my mother and my father. My relationship with my mother was very, very close. I guess one of the reasons it was so close, I was the youngest child, and also that during my first 12 years of my life, I was a sickly child, I guess, and so therefore she paid particularly close attention to me. And in those days of time, if she had not been so caring, I probably would not have survived that time. But she always tried to do things for me. I was a very finicky, picky eater, and but I always knew, and there was never any doubt in my mind about the love that my mother had for me and that I had for her. I don't guess we could have been any closer. I don't think any mother has ever had any son any closer to her than I was, particularly the first 15, 16, or 17 years of my life. My father was a loving person. However, it was very difficult for him to exhibit that, and I really didn't understand him most of my life. As I grew older, I began to understand him more and more and realize what a great deal of intelligence that he had and a great deal of caring that he had for his family. But as I say, it was very difficult for him to show emotions. He was particularly fond of Connie, my wife, and I'll get to her later. But in the earlier, I want to talk about the earlier years now. And it was something that I wish that I would have been smarter and would have been able to been closer to him. I know that he wanted the very best for me. I know that. I know that he was not always satisfied with the way that I did things, but I think in the long term he might have been proud of the few things that I've been able to do in my lifetime. I guess school now, probably I should talk a little bit about school. The school that I went to was 1 through 12, all in the same building. And most of the people that we started out with 15, 18 people in a class and wound up with, in the end, about 5 of us. My first memories of school was a teacher that we had named Calloway. She was a very excitable person, and she had a hard time controlling the children, and I remember very little about her except she did scream a lot. My sister Mary Louise taught me a little bit I think it was in the 3rd and 4th grade. 3rd or the 4th grade, I can't remember which one. At that time I had another good friend, a young friend, name was James O'Neill. He was the son of one of the O'Neills who was I guess to my mother, she was his aunt. And he was a very good friend of mine, but he didn't stay long. Soon after we started to school together, he left, and I never saw him again. His father died, and his mother went to California, and never saw him again. I always regretted that. I felt like that we had some kind of rapport or feeling. I had a teacher in the 5th and 6th grade that I dearly loved. She was from Wilmot, and she was the first person, I believe, that really gave me the opportunity to really be interested in learning. She was interesting, and she was pleasant, and it was just a super good couple of years for me that I remember. The only thing that, and then I went to the 6th to the 7th grade, and that's when I began to have some serious health problems, and they lasted through the 7th and 8th grade, and those times were very, very difficult to me, and there are times that were not pleasant, and about the only thing I did during those times was begin to read, and that's where I began my reading when I became sick. I remember the first thing that I read was a 20-volume book of knowledge, because there was very little opportunities to read things and very few places to secure books, so I'd get them any way that I could and read anything that I could. And at that point in time, I guess I began what I call scatter reading, is that I'll read anything, and still do till this day, and still is one of the great joys of my life is to be able to read. After I got into high school, and high school in Parkdale was a 9th grade. The principal joy there was 2 or 3 good teachers. I remember a geometry teacher that we had that was an outstanding teacher that taught me geometry that I remember to this day. It has given me the basis of understanding the geometrical proportions of things. Mr. Porter then, no, before that, Mr. Purifoy became principal of the high school, and he revived basketball. At that time, basketball had, since I had one brother, and both my brothers were excellent athletes. Higdon was an excellent basketball player and a better baseball player, and my brother James was probably the best athlete in the family, and particularly a basketball player. He could play the game and he could shoot that basketball. I was never as good as either one of them playing basketball or baseball. I played a little basketball and a little baseball and softball in school, and later on played in the Army and in college, but I never approached the type of athlete that either one of them were in high school. They were very, very, very good athletes and very, very proficient, particularly my brother James, and in basketball. And so most of my, I remember them playing some. I remember them playing basketball and baseball. And as time came on, they, by that time, of course, by the time I got to high school, both of my sisters had been long gone, and my brother Higdon was in the process. He was gone too, and then my brother James was finishing it up, and fairly soon he was gone too, because World War II came along, and they all left. When World War II began, I had the paper route in Parkdale, and I never shall forget an extra coming out on Sunday. That was the day of Pearl Harbor, and meeting the bus, and that's where I got the papers from the bus, and sold out immediately as soon as I got them, as soon as they came in. Also during that time, I worked in the drugstore in Parkdale, and I always did nearly anything from the time I can remember to make a nickel or a dime, because those were hard times. My family had gotten in pretty good financial shape. They owned a farm and a general store, and were in fairly good financial statement when the Great Depression came along, and that nearly destroyed the financial resources that my father had built up, and he finally had to close the store, and but was able to save the land, which we own to this day. I know it was a very difficult time for him, and I know that I can't remember that time when they were financially secure, and he only became financially secure again till somewhere back in the 50s, when it took him that long to recover from those devastating times. And I remember him having to work at jobs in addition to the farm in order to make way for the family. And I know they made many sacrifices for their children. All of their children, all of my mother and father's children, were sent to college. Not all finished. In fact, I think I'm the only child that did eventually graduate from college. But they all were given the opportunity, and all of them did receive some type of formal education beyond high school. During the war years, as a boy, Elton and I and I might tell another story about Elton too. I remember he was deathly afraid that his father would come and get him. And his father did come and get him one time, didn't keep him too long, and he came back to live with us again. And I remember one time his father came, and we were just sure that he was going to take Elton again, and so I hid Elton. And they asked me where he was, and I fibbed and told the story and said I didn't know where he was. I didn't know where he was, and so Elton didn't come out. And they said, well, he's not, and they knew that I knew where Elton was, and so Mother finally convinced me that Uncle Tom, who was my mother's brother and Elton's father, was not going to take Elton away. And so she convinced me, and so I did go and get him, and told him that, and convinced him that he wasn't going to take him away. And so I went and got him where he was hid. He was hid pretty good. I don't think they'd have found him. And he came out and said goodbye to his father, and that was probably the relationship that Elton had with his father. He did not want to live with his father. He wanted to live with his Aunt Jimmy, who was, to him, his mother. Elton's mother had mental problems and had been confined to a mental institution. The people of Parkdale were by and large good people. And they were the kind of people that helped you when you were in trouble. But because it was a small town, there was some viciousness attached to the gossip that went on, and but I guess that was just a normal part of the things. But at that time, you didn't have to lock doors, and you didn't have to worry about people. One of the things that went on during this period of time, this is just prior to World War II, and during World War II, was something that I did not understand at the time. The black people in that community were separate and apart from the white people. It was as if they lived in two different countries. And I remember late night meetings of the churches of the black people. I was told that they were plotting to overthrow the whites and do bad things. I know now that was not true. I know that they were simply, that was one of the only social places that they had to be together was in the church. I might try to describe what the situation was. I guess the best way to describe it is, I remember going with my father one cold morning, and if he wanted to hire one of the people on his farm to do some work for him, or to talk to them, or to whatever, what he would do is he would go up to the house that they lived in, which was owned by my father, and he would not go to the front door, but he would knock on the porch to get their attention if they were not outside. I remember that morning we walked up to this house where this black family lived, and I don't know what my father wanted with them, but he knocked on the porch. And I can remember to this day this large black man 35 or 40 years of age, came out and said, "Hello, Mr. Hill. Hello, Mr. Johnny Keith." And here I am, a little boy, 6 or 7 or 8 years old. And to this day, I can remember that, and to this day, through my mind, I knew that was not right. That was the way it was, though. Wherever I went, I was called Mr. Johnny Keith, and I was, maybe I probably understood the black people in that community better than most people because of Thelma, who was who helped raise me, who was our cook and my nurse, and wherever she went, I went. If she went in the black community, I went. She went to the black honky-tonk, I went with her. Wherever she went, I went. And I was kind of accepted a little bit better. Even when I was very young, on up through my high school days, I was accepted by the black community, maybe a little bit better. And I had a little better feeling for them. I knew they were in desperate circumstances. And it was not through any particular fault of anybody, but there was just no way, hardly any way at all, for them to break out of the trap that they were in. Once in a while, one of them would be able to get enough money together to go to Chicago or Detroit and try to secure a little bit better employment and have a little bit better life. It was a hard, hard life. It was not only a hard life for the black sharecroppers, but for the white sharecroppers too. But the life was tougher for the black sharecroppers than it was for the white. I never shall forget one incident that occurred when I was sometimes in high school. On a Saturday night in Parkdale, the streets were full, the merchants stayed open till 10, 11 o'clock at night, and the little town was full of people, black people and white people. And they walked up and down the street, or they sat in their cars, or they sat in their wagons, and visited and talked, and it was just an unusual time. And an attempt to describe it is pretty hard to do. But you would just see people walking up and down the street, going in and out of the stores and visiting. I never will forget a good friend of my father and another white man were standing in front of a store talking. And a black that was on his farm came up to him. He was about half intoxicated. And he came up to him and stood a little bit apart from him. And this man, whose name was Hinton, who was a great friend of my father's and a great friend of our family's, saw him. And he knew that he wanted to talk to him, but he was talking to a white man. And pretty soon, the black man, I guess, couldn't stand it any longer, and he came a little closer and said, "Mr. Hinton, I want to talk to you." And when he said that, he reached behind him, and there was a rack of shovels and rakes and hoes and things, and he picked up one of the shovels and just hit him in the head with it and said, you don't come up and talk to me when I'm talking to another white man."